All
All right, looks like we still have people trickling in, so as usual, we'll go ahead and wait a minute to get started. But as always, Jeff McCartney's here with me today, and he will be there to answer questions. So if you have any questions about anything during the webinar, please feel free to ask, and we'll go ahead and get those addressed for you. Okay, so today what we're going to be talking about are the render settings. And render settings aren't always the most exciting subject in KeyShot. However, if you take the time to understand what the render settings are, you're going to save yourselves a lot of time and ultimately a lot of money when you're doing your work in KeyShot. And in my experience, I've noticed a lot of times people come in here and they like to turn all these settings up all the way, and in a lot of scenarios I've seen that they're turning these settings up and it's actually not going to give them any improvement in the quality of their image. So hopefully today, this will help you better understand what these settings are and when to increase them, so you can save yourself some time when cranking out renderings. And we'll also go over the different render modes. So you should notice that in the render options you have the option to go to advanced control, you can do maximum samples, and you can also do maximum time. So we'll talk about the differences between those as well. Okay, so looks like everybody's pretty well settled in here, so let's get rolling. So I'll go ahead and just start with the render window itself. And most of you, especially if you've used KeyShot for a while, you're probably familiar with this menu here with advanced control. So we'll start with the first item in the list, and that's going to be samples. Now what samples are basically for every pixel that's rendered in a scene, rays are shot out from that pixel to collect information about the scene, and its information is returned back to that pixel to determine its final shade. Now let me break that down a little bit more clearly here. So imagine we were rendering this particular scene here. Now if we had our samples set to 16, what that's going to do, imagine we have a pixel right here. What that's going to do is that's going to send 16 rays out into the scene in random directions, all the different areas, and when these rays come into contact with either a material or an environment, it's going to collect information about that material, its color, whether it's reflective, whether it's refractive, all sorts of information, and then it's going to return that back to that individual pixel. And that's what's going to determine its final shade. So if you set your samples to 16 as they're set here, essentially for every single pixel in this image, it's going to send out 16 rays just like this. And we have an image that is 1281 by 637, so you multiply those two. So if we do 1281 times 637, we have a total of 815,997 pixels in our image. So for every single one of those pixels, 16 rays are going to be shot out. So you can see there's a lot of calculation that goes into this when you're increasing the samples number. So if you multiply that times 16, these are how many calculations we have with just one ray bounce for that entire image. Okay, so if you decide to up that to 32 samples, then you get even more rays. Okay, so it's going to collect even more information about this pixel surrounding environment. And if you go to 64, you get even more. Okay, so what are samples good for? Let's go back to our scene here and we'll take a look at something. I'm just going to go ahead and import a simple sphere. And let me just snap this to the ground. And we'll duplicate this and move it. And we'll duplicate it one more time and move that. And I'll go ahead and just hide these other objects in the scene. And let's take a look at samples in action and when you might actually want to increase those. So what I'll do is I'll just make these a metal material. And let's just get rid of the color. So we'll just have something like a chrome. Okay. And I'll copy this and paste it. And then I'll just unlink these two because we'll set some different values on each one of these. So samples are going to come into play when you have rough materials. So if you have a plastic that has roughness or if you have metal that has roughness, the samples are going to become more important. You see here how we have these perfectly sharp reflections. Because everything is so sharp and reflective about this, you don't need a whole bunch of rays to come out and sample the environment because it's essentially a straight bounce and then straight back. Okay, so you can get away with lower samples when you have items that are perfectly reflective. If we start to increase the roughness on this, since we do have this roughness, it requires a little bit more samples to actually do that in a quality manner. So let's paste this around. So I'm going to increase the roughness just a little bit more. And I'll unlink these materials. And I'm going to show you samples, how you can set that per material. Because you can set it in your render settings, but to illustrate this to you in real time, we'll do this per material. So if we look at this material parameters, and we expand this roughness option, we have 9 samples set on this material right now. So for the very first sphere, let's go ahead and set that to something really low, like 3. Okay. And on the next sphere, let's go ahead and set that to something higher, like 16. Oops. Okay, so let's set those samples to 16. And on the next one, let's set those samples to something even higher, like 64. Okay, so let's take a look here. So as I move the camera around, we'll stop and we'll let this start to res up. You can see how much more noise there is over here on this, this material that has only 3 samples. This one has 32, and we have a much smoother, less noisy result. And over here we have 64. Now depending on what you're going for, you know, the noise might not necessarily be a bad thing. This is a rough metal and it appears to have a little bit more texture to it because there are lower samples set on it. So I mean that might also be something that you can use to your advantage and in your favor. But also let's take a look here. Notice the difference between 32 and 64 samples. We both have very smooth results. You know, so that's something you really want to ask yourself. If we are doubling our calculations, so here we are at 32, and then we're going up to 64, and really there's not a whole lot of a difference in the rendered result. Is it really worth going up to, you know, the 64 bounces? And generally, I would say the answer to that is going to be no. Most of the time, if I'm doing stuff for production, I don't really need to go above 32 samples. 64 in, you know, extreme cases, but for the most part, 32 is going to do it for you. But also, you know, if you're looking for something that has a little bit more texture to it in the rough material, you might want to go ahead and just set it to a lower sample value. Now, here's the thing about samples. You noticed I set them on the material here. This will essentially be an override for what you set in your render settings. So if you have your samples set here on the material, a lot of times it's a more efficient way to work. So, for example, what if my scene is all perfectly reflective, perfectly polished objects? Maybe for my global settings, all I want is something like 16 samples or 8 samples. I can go into my rough objects, I can expand this roughness parameter, and I can set a different value there, and that's going to render that particular material out at that value. So essentially what it's going to do is it's going to put the rendering power where it's needed based on where you tell it to go. Okay, so that's a little look at samples there. Hopefully that explains that for you. let's talk about something else here that is actually very closely related to samples, and you'll see how that is in a minute. Go to the render window. Let's take a look at the next item in the list, and that's going to be Raybounces. Okay, so Raybounces are essentially the number of times that all of those sample rays bounce around a scene before they return back to that pixel to determine its final shape. Okay, so again, you can really see here exponentially how the amount of calculations are increasing as you start to increase these values. So that's why it's really important to know when to increase them and when you can turn them down. Now with Raybounces, there's a really great way to determine if you need them or not. If we go to the project window, we go to the settings tab. In there we do have a Raybounces option, and we can tune that interactively and see its result in the real-time window. So as I start to drop this down, you can see all of our samples, what they're doing here, because I have Raybounces set to 1, they're only sending rays out once and then returning back to that pixel to determine its final shape. So we're not getting any sort of transparency because we have multiple surfaces here that these rays need to bounce around in between to actually render this transparent result. So Raybounces are going to be important anytime you're rendering transparent objects. Now the great thing is you can tune this in real time. So if I start to increase this, so if I go from 1 to 2 and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, I noticed an improvement on the look of my image. Maybe I'll go higher. And you can keep increasing this until you get to a point where you notice, hey, I'm not really noticing any more of a visual improvement. Then you probably want to say, okay, that number is sufficient. So you can see here, as we increase this, there were some black spots on the inside of the diamond that have gone away now. And that's because we have allowed for enough light bouncing to go around on the inside of there. And it's starting to fill in those black areas. And we may also get to a point where, okay, yeah, I am noticing a difference between 13 and 14. But is it really that much that it's going to make or break my image? I mean, that's when I want to get to a point that it's like, okay, can I get away with 13? And if so, then you're probably going to want to use that value. And also, you'll notice here, if we look at this mirror, so when we have 0 bounces, there's no light bouncing around the scene, so everything's rendered black. Go to 1 bounce, okay. We can see that the mirror is reflecting something, but we're not seeing any sort of shading on that object because that would be 2 bounces. So now we can see some shading on the object, but there's no transparency because that would be more light bouncing around on the inside of here to render that result. So the objects that you will need this for, if you're doing anything glass bottles, headlight enclosures, jewelry with gemstones, this is where all these are going to come into play. The more complex objects like diamonds or headlight enclosures on cars, they're going to require more Raybounces. Scenes without complex, transparent, or reflective objects, you probably get away with somewhere between 5 and 8 bounces, and that would be sufficient. But keep in mind, let's take a look at these samples again and how they relate to Raybounces. So if we have our scene set to 16 samples, and each pixel sends out 16 rays into the scene, if we have 8 Raybounces, all 16 of these rays are going to bounce around 8 times around the scene before they finish their calculation. So just to give you an idea about how much calculating is going on and how those two tie together. Okay, so let's talk about the next item in the list, and that's anti-aliasing. So with anti-aliasing, I'm going to go ahead and use Photoshop to show a good example of what that really is. And you all should be pretty familiar with it once you see the example here. Okay, so images inside of computers are composed of pixels. And as we all know, pixels are square. So if you look in here, if we look at the edge of this letter, what we can see here is a little bit of fading effect. On the inside, let's check what our color value is. And we have 219, 22, 22. So that's our red value here. Now if we look at the edge, that one's faded out to 232, 109, 109. And if we look at the very most outer edge, that's 242, 182, 182. There might even be another layer. No, that's white. So what you can see here is these edges, they essentially fade out the pixel. And what that does is that creates a smooth edge look anywhere that you have edges. Let's take a look at what that looks like without any anti-aliasing. So if you take up here in Photoshop and you set that to none, look at what we have going on here. The edge looks quite a bit more ragged. You have much more of a stair-step effect. So there's the difference right there with anti-aliasing versus no anti-aliasing. Now, the thing about that, as it applies to KeyShot, for the most part, you're going to be able to get away with the default value. So you saw what edges look like with no anti-aliasing on those letters, and you could definitely see when they looked ragged and rough. This scene right here was rendered out with the default value of anti-aliasing. Okay? And you can see there's no really sharp, jagged edges or nothing that stands out as being a problem in that area. So for the most part, you're probably going to be able to get away with just leaving that at the default value. If you're doing stuff for print, you know, go ahead and bump it up to around 4, but I wouldn't go much higher than that. Okay, so the next item in the list is shadow quality. Now what shadow quality is going to do is it's going to control the quality of the rendered ground shadow. Okay, but there's a couple things that go into account with the ground shadow, and I want to go ahead and show you those. So this may have happened to you before when you're working in KeyShot. If you look at this particular shadow, you can almost see some square-shaped artifacts here. And what that is the method that the ground shadow is calculated in KeyShot. You can think of the ground plane in KeyShot as being subdivided up into little grid squares. And every one of those little grid squares has shading information about the ground shadow, and that's what actually renders that. Now, say that this ground plane is 8 by 8 squares. That's not a whole lot to render a ground shadow on. So as you start to increase that shadow quality, what it's going to do is it's going to subdivide that grid up even more and packs more squares into a smaller area, and then you get more resolution in your shadow. So you can see when we increased our shadow quality in the real-time view, that got rid of those square-shaped artifacts. However, before you go doing that, you're going to want to keep your shadow quality at 1, and you're going to want to go over to the Environment tab. And under there you have this option called ground size. So what we're going to do as we reduce this is we're taking the same amount of grid squares, but we're packing them into a tighter area. Now there's one thing to watch out for, and if you see here, you can see this square plane. That's our ground plane, and this is what's divided up into those tiny little grid squares. You can almost think of them as pixels. So if you have an image that's made up of very few pixels, what happens? You have a low resolution image and it's not very clear. Same thing with with the ground plane. So what you want to do is you want to get your ground size as small as you can, because you're going to take the minimum amount of grid squares that you have and you're going to pack them into the smallest area possible. So that's going to give you some pretty good resolution. Okay, but what you do want to watch out for is the clipping of this shadow. If in your scene your shadow is getting clipped, that's going to be an issue. It's going to look funny. So you'll want to just reduce your ground size as much as you can without getting the shadow clipping. And then in the real-time tab, what you can do is go over to your shadow quality, and you can take a look, get close up at your ground shadow, and take a look and see if you have any of those artifacts. And if you do, then you can always turn up your shadow quality, and when you get to a value that cleans up all those artifacts, you know that's what you can set over here in your render settings. And just to show you again how the ground size affects the ground shadow, let's take a look at that ground size again. So we'll reduce this all the way down, and you can see how the plane is clipping. And let's go in and let's take a look at the shadow on our diamond here. It looks nice. Let's increase this ground size. So we're taking the same amount of grid squares, but we're spreading them out over a larger area. And you can actually see those grid squares expanding. Okay. So the quality of your shadow is going to have a pretty big impact or effect based on your ground size. So like I said, reduce this first, get it as small as you can, and then come over here and start increasing the shadow quality if necessary. Once you find the value that works for you in the settings tab, you can go back over to the render tab, type that value in there, and you know you're not increasing that without any additional gain to your final image. Okay, so let's move on to global illumination quality. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to change the gem here to a red color. And I'm going to make the ground plane white. Okay, so let's take a look and talk about what global illumination really is. So if you look under the settings tab, you should see this option called detailed indirect illumination. Now what that's going to do is that's going to cause the light that bounces from this object to spill onto any objects around it. So let me turn this on and I'll show you what I mean. So even though this object isn't luminous, it's not emitting light, you still have light hitting it, bouncing off of it. That light is changing color based on the colors of the spectrum that are absorbed by this material and the colors that are reflected. So that reflected light bounces off of here and then bounces down onto the ground plane. So you get this red color spilling onto there. Let's turn off detailed indirect illumination and see what we get. Okay, so there we have a much flatter shadow. You're not getting that indirect light bouncing occurring. So the global illumination setting is going to control the quality of that result. Now, the thing about the global illumination is it can dramatically increase your render time. So in most scenarios, I'd say 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to be able to get away with leaving that at 1. I hardly ever increase that value, and there's very few circumstances that I find that I need to do that. So I mean, if your render times are shooting through the roof and you've been turning up this setting right here, that's probably a large factor of why those render times are so long. Okay. Now the times that this can become useful is when you have 2 matte objects right next to each other. So in this particular case, we have a diffuse object that's sitting on top of another diffuse object. So these items aren't reflective. Now sometimes you can see a little bit of a chunky effect in your shadows when you have 2 objects like that next to each other. If you start to have that effect, something you might want to do is try increasing this value. And if you are trying to determine what value you need for something like this, I suggest taking advantage of the region render. So what you can do is you can enable region render. You can zoom in to a small area. Set your global illumination quality value. Press render, and it's going to render only that particular area. So that's a good way to go about tuning your render settings and figuring out how much you actually need. Okay, so pixel filter size. Pixel filter size, what that does is that applies a slight blur to your image. Okay, so a lot of times when you're doing stuff that's CG rendered, one of the biggest issues with it is that it appears too perfect. So what pixel filter size does is it applies a slight blur to that image to sort of soften things a bit. Now this is probably one of those things that you'll want to leave at the default value. It's not too intense, and it's not, you know, too sharp. The thing about increasing this is once you increase that value, if it comes out too blurry, then you're stuck unless you want to re-render. So I generally just tend to leave this at the default value, and if I decide it's too sharp, you know, that's something I'll probably address in Photoshop. That way I don't over blur it and I don't have to come back and re-render. Okay, so let's take a look at depth of field quality, or DOF quality. In case you weren't sure what DOF stands for, it stands for depth of field, and it has to do with a lens effect that we can simulate in KeyShot that real-world photographers tend to use. So if we go under the camera settings in the project window, we can scroll down to the bottom, and right on there you have the option to add depth of field. And what depth of field is going to do is it's going to simulate the lens focusing on a certain area of your scene while other areas in the scene appear blurred out. For example, if we open up this particular scene here and we hide the samples, if you look here, you know, the fruit basket is what's in focus, and back here we have this image that's, you know, blurred out, this painting back here. And also, you know, the skull on the table is a bit blurred out, and so is the table. So that's a result of depth of field. Now when you're setting up your depth of field, once you enable it, you can select your focus point, so you can click there. And as you decrease your f-stop, it's going to cause more blur. As you increase the f-stop, you're going to experience less blur. Okay, so if we go to the render settings, I'll tell you this. This default value of 1 for production renderings is generally not going to be enough. I found through you know, just experimenting and trying different values that if I'm doing something for production, I like to set the value to at least a value of 3. You know, in some cases you may need to go even higher. Like if you've got time and, you know, you're doing something for print, you might want to try a value of more around 5. But for production, you know, like I said, at least a value of 3. Otherwise, you're going to notice a little bit of noise and some artifacts back there in your depth of field. Okay, so sharp shadows, that's essentially what it says. Sharp shadows is going to create realistic sharp shadows casting across your geometry. That's one of those settings I tend to just leave it checked, and I forget that it exists, because it's, you know, it really is the accurate way to render your scenes. But, you know, if maybe you're not desiring some sharp shadows, or there are some artifacts in your sharp shadows that are becoming a distraction for you, you can always disable this and re-render your scene and see if you like that result better. But that's what that setting does. Okay, the next item on the list is going to be sharper texture filtering. And sharper texture filtering, what that does, go ahead and open up the library here. And let's just go ahead and grab a wood. So what sharper texture filtering does is whenever you view textures at an extreme angle, so for example, if we look at this, we're looking at this wood texture straight on. What if I was more parallel with this? Or more eye level? What can happen is you can start to lose detail when you look at textures at this particular angle. And what sharper texture filtering does is it tries to improve the quality of that texture when you view it at an extreme angle like that. Also, I like to turn it on if I'm rendering small textured plastics, things like that with very fine amounts of detail. I'll turn that on to try and preserve additional detail there. But also, one of the things that's going to come into account when you are trying to, say, render textured plastics with small, fine amounts of detail are the samples. Because remember, if we take a look at what samples are doing, if you're only sending a few amounts of rays out into the environment and you have all this fine detail in your texture, it's going to come back. And if you remember what our spheres looked like, they looked noisy and they weren't very smoothly rendered. That's because there wasn't enough detail being sampled about the environment. So, like I said, if you are doing a fine textured plastic, you might want to turn on sharper texture filtering, and you'll probably want to go ahead and increase those samples. Okay, so that's pretty much wraps up the advanced control settings. Do we have any questions on anything that was covered?
No.
No? Okay.
Well, actually, just 1 second.
Okay. So yeah, if we have any questions on anything that was covered, please feel free and ask, and I can go back and address.
Did you cover how advanced control and the settings tab play together? And how a Raybounce setting in the settings tab doesn't affect the Raybounce setting in the output tab?
Yes and no, I did, but I'll go ahead and clarify that.
Yeah.
So okay.
Questions on that?
Okay. So as you can see, there are a couple places that you set your render settings. So we have our settings tab, which exists in the project window, and all this affects the real-time look of your image. And you'll notice we have Raybounces here, and we also have Raybounces here. So if I increase these Raybounces in our settings tab, that's not going to control the final render. So if I set that to a value of 6 here, or a value of 9, you can see the render options don't update. Now in 3.2, that will actually update. So we are finalizing 3.2 right now, so we're getting ready to release the next version. And one of the big changes there is going to be if you set your Raybounces here to 14 or 15, it will also reflect that over here.
And actually, it'll only sync if the setting in the real-time settings is higher than what's in the output tab.
Okay.
So you can force a lower setting for real time and a higher setting for output.
Right. Right. So yeah. But yeah, you can come in here and override the setting in the render output window than the settings window. But for now, in all your current versions, if you increase your Raybounces here and you find that this is the value you like, you'll need to go over to your render window and type that value in. Okay. Same for shadow quality. If you find that your shadow quality in real time is good at a value of 4, you'll want to come over to your render options window and you'll want to set your shadow quality to a value of 4. Okay, one of the questions was, can you please show how the scale of the texture was altered again? So yeah, I'll go ahead and cover that really quick. If I click on this, this ground plane here, that's going to pull up the material parameters. And if I click in the texture tab, I have the option to select this color texture, and from here I can adjust the scale. Okay. And also, I want to point out too, while we're on the subject of increasing, decreasing scale of textures, I did just do a 3-part tutorial on creating your own materials in KeyShot, so you can find that under our YouTube channel. So if you're having any questions about material creation or working with textures, that 3-part tutorial series should really answer quite a few questions for you regarding that topic. Can you change the default render settings? I find that I use different default than what is set. Actually, no, you can't. There are no presets that you can define on your own. Maybe that is something we will look into for future versions, but at the moment, no, you cannot. Okay, can you explain the effects section in more detail? So if we go under the Settings tab, let me go ahead and change this diamond material to an emissive. So the emissive is KeyShot's light emitting material. And if I darken my environment, go ahead and set a black background color here. So if I darken my environment, you can see that this emissive material is emitting light. Now if we go into the Settings tab, we can enable our effects, and then that gives us the option to have this bloom intensity and bloom radius. So bloom intensity and bloom radius are going to essentially be able to add glow to objects within your scene. And generally what I find to be a successful approach for that is a low intensity value and a higher radius value. So we can type in a higher value than we need, or than the slider range allows. So if I wanted to do something like 80, I could do that. You can see we're getting this, softer glow around this emissive material. If you start to increase this bloom intensity too much, you can see you get this kind of unrealistic result. So, and what this is going to work off of is this looks for the brightest pixels in your scene, and it's going to apply the glow and this sort of halo effect to those brightest pixels. Since this is emitting light, this gets the halo effect. You can see back here, our wood texture, which is not emitting light, is not getting that halo effect. Now the other thing we have in the Effects tab is the ability to add vignetting. Let me go ahead and change the color here of our background. And I'll just change this to something like a metal material, or might as well just go gemstone. So under the Settings tab, we can increase our vignetting strength. And what that's going to do is that's going to darken the edges of your image, and it's going to try and bring the viewer's eye inward. So just to sort of focus more on what's at the center of your image, so you can use that to your advantage. The effects do use GPU. It's a very basic GPU effect, so it doesn't require anything special. If your effects aren't able to be accessed, what you may want to check in your preferences under the Advanced tab is Enable GPU. Okay, so as long as that's checked, you should be able to access these effects. Okay, shadows. Keep getting segments in my shadows, not squares, but radial. Yeah. If you could send an image to support, we can take a look at it, and we can help you out with that. Can an emissive object cast shadows? Emissive objects will not really cast shadows because they're emitting light, but I'll show you what they will do. Let's go ahead and hide some parts here.
Did you already do max samples of them?
Okay. So if we change these planes out here to emissives, and we turn on our ground indirect illumination, if we start to increase that brightness, eventually we're going to blow out that shadow. But the other thing you can do with emissives is you can tell them to, let's take a look here. What you can do with emissives, if you click on their properties, you can go under the Advanced, you can turn off visible in shadows, visible in reflections, and visible to camera. And essentially you can hide those objects, but they can still emit light. So you see if I increase my intensity here, it's affecting the look of that gemstone. So even though they're hidden, they're still affecting the scene. But if you did want them to cast shadows, you should be able to turn the intensity down and then hide the object, and yeah, they will still cast shadows. So, if you want to use that in some way, shape, or form, yeah, you can do that. Okay. So moving on here, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the different, the other rendering modes that we have. Okay, so if you look under the output options, you have the option to do maximum time and also maximum samples. Maximum time is pretty straightforward. It's very self-explanatory. So you can set how long you want your image to render in hours, minutes, seconds, and if you want, even milliseconds. So if I wanted something to render for 3 hours, if I knew I had a deadline in that amount of time, I could set it for 3 hours, and I would get the best quality image that I could get in that amount of time. Now, the nice thing about these render modes, what they are going to do, they are going to take your settings from the Settings tab. You notice when we have maximum time set, we don't have all the options to adjust Raybounces, global illumination quality. We don't have any of those options that we had when we were looking at advanced control. So maximum time is going to take your render settings from the Project Settings tab. So if you look at your Raybounces, your shadow quality, all that is going to be applied here when you're using the maximum time option. Okay. Now the other nice thing about that, maybe I don't know how long my render is going to or needs to take. What I can do, I can set it to something like 50 minutes. I can press render, and you should notice that it uses a little bit different rendering method. It's using the same rendering method that the real-time window uses to generate this image. You notice we don't have those little blocks filling in. With the advanced control, you have all these big blocks that render themselves out. They do an initial pass, and then they go back through and they clear themselves up before they deliver your final image. This is just more of a progressive rendering mode. So it's going to start out with your whole scene, and it's going to refine that whole entire scene. And the longer you let it sit and res up, the more it's going to refine itself. Now, if you get to a point, maybe you set it for 2 hours, and you're looking at your image and you say, hey, I don't need a full 2 hours. It's been an hour and it looks good enough. What you can do, you can press stop. You can stop the rendering, and if you look here, it says saved render to Raybounces 696.jpg. So wherever I had that image set to save to, even if I stop the rendering, it's going to save it out at that point in time. So that's kind of a nice thing to have there. Now, the next option is maximum samples. So if you remember from the samples example that I showed you guys, this is going to basically say, okay, if I have this set to 32, it's going to sample every pixel in the scene 32 times before it calls that render complete. Okay. Now, why this is useful in particular is when you're dealing with animations. Generally, I would recommend rendering your animations with maximum samples mode for this particular reason. Let's go ahead and set up a simple camera move. So I'll go under the Scene tab. I'll go ahead and add a translation here. And let's change our translation to 8 units on the X. Okay. So in this particular frame right here of this animation, we have a lot more going on in our scene. Okay. So this is actually more intensive to render than, say, when we're off to the side here. Okay. Now what if I had my render mode set to maximum time? So what if I said, okay, for every frame, I want you to sit and I want you to render that frame for 50 minutes. Being that this frame out here on the outer edge is a lot easier to render, you're going to have a lot more of a refined look in the rendered image here than you would at this point in time when it's more complex to render, because both of those frames were given the same amount of time to render. Now, instead of doing that, if you set it to maximum samples, every frame is going to be rendered at 32 samples, whether it takes 5 minutes or 15 minutes, depending on the complexity of the frame. So that's going to give you a very nice, even result in your animations. Just like this example right here, if you did it with maximum time, there's a very good possibility that you're going to have possibly some flickering or some sort of visual artifacts in your animation. So that's why I would recommend using maximum samples for your animations. And just like the maximum time, if I set something to maximum samples and I push the render button and I'm sitting there looking at my image and I say, hey, I'm happy with that quality, if I press the stop button, it's still going to save that image out. Okay, so that's a look at all the different render settings, advanced control, maximum time, maximum samples. Hopefully, this will clarify some things for you and hopefully save you some time when you're working on your project so that you're not setting render settings very high without any actual added gain to your final image. We'll stick around for a little while longer in case anyone has any questions. So if it's anything rendering or related, anything render settings related, or anything KeyShot in general, feel free. We've got about 10 minutes here, so I'll be happy to field any questions and answer anything you may have.
Should probably cover where we post these things online.
Okay. So if you go to KeyShot.com, we will be posting the webinar online. And under our resources section, you have the option to go to tutorials, webinars, quick tips. So here we'll be posting this one later on today, so you can go back and watch that if you would like. Also, on here, you can see here are the new material creation tutorials. So that's under resources and under tutorials. You'll find those at the bottom. Covers the basics, covers using textures, and then essentially putting it all together, and this was the final result of that tutorial. So we talked about different material types like translucent material, using the plastic material and really how versatile that particular material type is. So if you ever wanted to know a little bit more about creating your own materials in KeyShot, I highly recommend taking a look at that. And unless anyone has any questions, let's see, can you go over the samples again in the render options window? Sure. So yeah, because samples are actually, they're a very important concept to understand. So let's go ahead and take a look at samples one more time. Be happy to cover that for you. And we'll see what they actually do for our scenes. Okay, so let's take a look at this example again. So what samples do? Samples basically, for every single pixel that's rendered in your image, a certain amount of rays are sent out from that pixel. These rays bounce around the scene, they collect information about this pixel's surrounding environment, they return that information back to that pixel, and that's what helps determine its final shade. Okay, so as you increase this value, this essentially shows what 16 samples might look like. So we have one pixel here on this metal material, and it's shooting out all these rays, and all these rays are going out. They're collecting information about its environment, and they come back and they say, okay, you're going to be this particular shade. If you have 32 samples, you increase that number. If you have 64 samples, you increase that even more. So you can see all these rays that would essentially be fired out into the scene to collect information. Now this happens for every single pixel in your image. And as you can see, as you start to increase that setting, it's very, it really dramatically increases the amount of calculations that are being done. Okay? Especially when you start factoring in, hey, what if I have 8 Raybounces? So these 64 rays are going to bounce around 8 times, before they return back to that one pixel, and that's just for a single pixel. So you want to make sure that you're using samples where you need them because they can really increase your render time. Now let's take a look at where you would actually need them. So it's going to come into play for rough materials. Okay, so we have these rough metal spheres here, and they have 3 different sample values. The one on the far left has a low value of 2. Okay? The value in the center has a value of 16, and the one on the outer edge has 64. So let's take a look at this here. If we stop moving the camera and we watch these res up, look how much more noise the one on the far left with only 3 samples has. Just think about it. Every pixel is only sending out 3 rays. So we end up getting more noise. On this one, we have every pixel sending out 16 rays. Okay? So it's clearing up a little bit faster. On this one, we have every pixel sending out 64 rays. So that one's even more clear. If you look at the noise and the grain in this one, you're not really seeing that here on the one that has 64 samples. Okay? But what that comes down to is that can also come down to personal preference. I mean, just because it's 64 samples doesn't necessarily mean better. You might want a metal that has a bit more of a textured effect like this one here. So you can actually use a lower sample value to create that rough-looking effect. Okay.
For more questions?
Sure.
Can you go over how the global illumination interacts with sample and rebound setting space? Because we have the GI quality.
Yeah.
Works. Did you already cover that?
Let's see here. Let me go ahead and open this up and we'll take a look. Okay, so one of the questions was, is the GI quality going to affect, samples and Raybounces, or how do they all tie together? The two that more directly tie together are going to be samples and Raybounces. You're not going to notice much of an effect on the global illumination quality by turning these up. The only thing you will notice by turning these up is you may have less noise in your in your rendered areas. So if your image has a little bit of noise in there and you're trying to clean that up, increasing the samples may do that for you. But you can see here, the only effect that Raybounces does have on global illumination is when we have them set to 0. Even if we turn it up to 1, we get enough light bouncing there that we do get that indirect light bouncing going on. Okay, so and if we look here, we increase from 1 to 2, not really noticing much of a difference there. So the global illumination quality is not tied too closely with the samples and the Raybounces. The only thing is, like if you look in here, if this image rendered out, and what if it looked like this, and there was all this noise and whatnot in there, then you could go back into the samples and increase that, and it would hopefully clear that up for you.
Can you explain a bit more of the philosophy of real-time rendering versus final or non-interactive rendering, and why they have different sets of settings? How do I know when to use one render method versus the other?
Okay, I got you. Okay, so one of the questions is, can you explain the difference between using real-time rendering and using the offline render, and why would you want to use one over the other? One thing to really keep into account here is when we're working in this real-time window, the larger this image is, the more pixels are being rendered, and the more it has an effect on performance. So if I'm working at this resolution that's taking up my entire screen, you're probably going to want to make sure you have some pretty good hardware to deal with that. Now, in the event that you don't, what you can do is you can lower this window down, and you can work at a smaller resolution, and your performance and your ability to move around the scene is going to be quite a bit better. Okay? And the other reason that you have these settings to control here is, again, it comes down to performance. If I am trying to navigate my scene quickly, and I might want to turn my quality settings all the way down, or even enter something like performance mode by pressing Alt-P. And then I can much more quickly move around the scene here. So, you know, that's why there is the settings tab, and then there's also these options to set your settings higher in the render output. Also because even if I set this to a really high resolution, my monitor is only 1920 by 1080. I still need to output this, you know, it's something maybe like 4000 by 4000 pixels if I'm trying to do something for print. So it's really a matter of, you know, real-time or working in the interface, setting up your scenes versus doing your final output. Okay, I'm trying to bring in a file that was done in KeyShot 2, but it turned black on KeyShot 3. It also seems to be losing the path where the environment was. You're going to want to make sure that your textures are also with that particular file. If you had textures assigned to that and they're in the old KeyShot 2 directory, KeyShot 3 is going to look in the KeyShot 3 directory for new textures. So you'll either want to make sure that those textures are stored with that particular bit file, or that they are in the new KeyShot 3 resources directory. And same with the environments. Can you access the gamma correction? Can you address the gamma correction that happens?
This one is a support issue.
Okay, gotcha. All right, I think we're about wrapping up all the questions here. If I didn't get to your question, you know, please feel free to send us an email to support@luxion.com, and you know, we'll be happy to address that for you. So as usual, you know, hope this helps, and we'll see you next month for the next webinar.
And a lot of this, there's a lot of questions, but they're really good, like forum discussion topics. So maybe you should link to the forum.
Okay, yeah. So we also do have a KeyShot forum, and if you ever do have questions, you know, granted we love answering the questions on the webinars, and that's why we do this for you guys. But if you get a question and there's no webinar this week, you can always go to the forum, and you can come here and get involved in some of the discussions. We also hang out on here and answer questions. So, you know,
Thomas spends all day there.
Yeah, so yeah, Thomas will help you out. You know, Jeff McCartney, he's on there too. Me, I show up when I can. But yeah, that's what it's there for. And there's also some really great users out there who are really good at what they do that are also more than willing to help out people who are just getting started here. So be sure and check that out and take advantage of that resource. So, all right, I think that about wraps it up for the day. And like I said, we'll see you next time.